Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. We're about to start this session, so hopefully we can have your attention. I wanted to say good afternoon to you and thank you all for continuing to hang in there with us. I think this is a very important topic, so for those of you who are here, I'm glad and hope that you will participate and engage fully. The topic that we're talking about right now is managing the institution's most critical risks, an enterprise risk management approach to managing cyber and fraud risk. We are in an era where the information that we transmit over our systems is very important. But the potential harm that can happen from losing that information or having a breach is even more critical to the functionality of your universities, your institutions, and the places that we learn. Our integrated relationship is important. And so we hope that we can give you some insight to that today. On the panel, we have professionals who have background from consulting to federal service to institutional service, being on campus right alongside you. And so we hope that their insights will both enlighten and help to inform you as we move forward. I will introduce the panelists, and then they will give presentations, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. So the first panelist today is Dr. Michael Dean. He is the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for Strategic Measures and Outcomes at Federal Student Aid. All of us on the stage work under his leadership, under General Brown's direction. His group is dedicated to looking at the portfolio as well as helping us enhance the management of all the federal student aid systems. Ms. Kathy Zilnick is our Chief Risk Officer, and she's helping us to manage a risk management program, one of the first in the federal government, and we have a long legacy of doing the right things in that area, and so I hope that she can lend some insights to you today. Mr. Wally Coy is our Senior Advisor under Cyber Risk Management at Federal Student Aid. Cyber risk is a very important area, and we're going to be doing a lot of things. You may have noticed the compliance supplement that came out in June 2019 that is an enforcement piece for all of you to pay attention to about how your infrastructure has to be prepared for cybersecurity risk, and so he'll be talking to that. And then Ms. Stephanie Powell, Senior Advisor for Fraud and Compliance at Federal Student Aid as well, will be giving her insights today as well. So without further ado, we'll allow Dr. Michael Dean to come to this podium, and please give him a hand as he comes forward.
Thank you, Ray. And I apologize in advance for my voice. It left me sometime this morning, and I haven't been able to find it since. But this is one of my favorite groups to have a conversation with because last year I presented on a similar topic as well as Kathy Zelnick, my colleague on my right, was here last year too. So while this presentation may seem on the surface, it's more of a practical type of presentation. It is really designed to help you as a president think about your role in providing tone at the top and leadership at your institution with primarily decision making, because in priority setting, if you think about risks, a lot of time people think of risk as a singular negative consequence, but really you can think of it as a trade-off. If you look at it, most presidents in here understand dollars. How many of you have dealt with navigating your budget year to year? Can you raise your hand? Every single person, right? So a lot of times, speaking about risk and planning and priorities and performance through the lens of dollars, resource allocation is very helpful because people understand that, especially presidents. So back to my academic institution days, I was a professor, I was an associate dean of a law school and a chief operating officer, and I had the privilege of negotiating with our university president over priorities for the college I was working in, and asking for an increased budget to support academic quality, because we thought we could get better outcomes on graduate school admission or graduation rates if we could improve our academic quality and support for our students. So the response I got from the president and from his chief budget officer was that in a good budget year, let's make that a priority and add this program. How many of you actually have had good budget years? So throughout my 20 years in the academy, I found out there's two states of budget. There's bad and there's crisis. And that's it. Would you agree with that? pretty much 100%. So as you can imagine, if you're thinking about risks to your institution, they're not just risks to your institution, they're risks to your students. They're risks to you as a professional. And really, if you think about it in the context of what poses a threat to achieving the objectives and the outcomes to my institution, if you think about risk that way. Let's take, for example, one of our presenters yesterday, Dr. Garcia, right? She talked about probably the most influential stress to public institutions was what? Unfunded mandates and disinvestment by states, right? So think about this. Can someone name an unfunded mandate that you've received in the past 5 years? Title IX? So what in particular about Title IX?
Coordinator, the managing of it all,
And how much state support have you received for that?
none.
Right? So so you have to spend money on getting that done, right? It's about reporting. So as you're looking at your bucket of resources throughout your campus, what has to take a loss in order for you to achieve your objectives on Title IX? So that's the type of question that, as Kathy Zelnick makes her presentation, to help you think about a way that at your campus you can take a look at your opportunities and your threats in the form of risk as a portfolio and really understand how much risk you're accepting in one area to achieve an objective in another area. Because oftentimes we deal with issues when they arise rather than dealing with the risk beforehand and understanding what our appetite is for a particular risk. For example, what's good enough? So let me ask you this question. If you knew you could spend $500,000 a year and cut in half the likelihood of acts of violence on your campus that harm students, but your academic quality would suffer, how would you make that decision? Would you accept a higher risk of violence on campus just to keep academic quality? I could have put different priorities together, but that's what I'm asking you to think about, and think about it intelligently. Intelligently, I mean really try to measure these things. And let's take into account some recent cyber breaches, like at Stanford University, let's say. How many of you remember the Enron case from a long time ago, right? And so why did we have the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation? You have it in your field. It's GASB 30 or something like that requires, or 31, that requires the president to attest to the financial statements, right? You got to sign off on that letter, right? Who is familiar with that in this audience? That's because presidents or CEOs can now no longer say, hey, that wasn't my job. I have a CFO for that. It's becoming that way in cybersecurity too. You have a data breach on campus. As a president, the days are drawing short where you can say, hey, I have a CIO. That's their job. I don't know much about it. I'm not a techie. You're going to have to know your risk posture. You're going to have to know what you've invested in and what you haven't. This all results in that to me, can you flip the slide, please? Oh, I'm flipping the slide. So I got a little bit ahead of myself. But it all goes into the more challenging times that university and college presidents are facing. So today what we're going to try to do is go through 4 different things. One is paint the institutional leadership and risk context, which we've already started talking about. And Kathy Zelnick will go through a framework and a way that you can take a look at managing your institutions through the lens of risk and resource allocation with the ultimate goal of achieving your objectives in the best way that you possibly can, and accepting at least the least amount of risk that your appetite at your institution can handle, whether it's for safety, whether it's for enrollment, whether it's for athletics in some cases. Wally is going to go through some technical, I guess you'll stay away from a lot of the technical terms, but he really wants to connect you with your responsibility as president and the cyber risk at your institution. And Stephanie Powell, who I might mention was an assistant dean for career services and a director of financial aid, so she's very familiar with the financial aid systems at colleges and universities. She's going to talk a little bit about fraud and why you need to know about it as a university president or college president. So I just went through these 4 objectives. I won't cover them. So let me ask you another question. In the past decade, do you think that the responsibilities of being a college president have become easier or more difficult? Are your jobs easier now than they were 10 years ago? No. So we see this, and this is my line of really like reading a lot of newspaper articles and looking at a bunch of data, is that, and also backed up by the American Council on Education, that college presidents find themselves in a setting that's unprecedented in its complexity. I would also say, because we have massively accessible media sources, meaning anybody can read the least little mistake you make as a college president or one of your team makes as a college president if a media source decides to pick it up. So you are under the microscope, more so now than any other point in the history, and it can be shared worldwide. And that will follow you, right, from place to place. It's not like the 70s where you made a few mistakes, people forget about that, you go. No, that stuff is in perpetuity, right, on digital format. So each of you also have professional risks when it comes to performing your responsibilities as president. The expectation of accountability has even become greater on the president. You've all heard of presidents getting ousted for something that they had no knowledge of, right? Because everybody wants to make the president accountable. 30 years ago, the president could easily remove this person or another person and be okay. Nowadays, everybody's calling for the president to step down. So you guys have some really, really challenging positions. And I would say, I mean, with my greatest of compliments, I think you have the hardest presidencies in the country. I mean, if you were at a Stanford, if you were at a, let's just say even a Cleveland State University or Ohio University, where your worries when you go to bed at night are my faculty going to like me tomorrow, right? Are they going to be engaged? Are they going to strike? You guys have to deal with food insecurities. You have to deal with home insecurities. When I was in Texas, I learned the stories of pretty much 2 distinct universities, and one of them, we had a president who's just, what he said to me is my biggest competition is not another university, it's poverty. It's finding a way to keep these kids in school and getting them to the finish line. I go to another university and I ask the president, what's keeping you awake at night? And he said, well, it's really, you know, are my faculty going to be engaged or are they going to strike because I haven't given them a raise in a while and my enrollment's too high at 2,500 people. I've got 2,400 students enrolled, but our endowment went from 1.3 billion to 1.2 billion. You know, those are different worries, right? So you guys, to me, have the hardest jobs of presidents in the country, and you also are so committed that oftentimes you and your faculty and your staff take lower salaries than what you could make other places just because you're so dedicated to your missions. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So let's take a look at the institutional leadership in the risk context. So 20 or 30 years ago, we were talking about fundraising, athletic performance, keeping of the traditions. Today, we're talking about fiscal solvency, enrollment pressures, including persistence and retention, right? Education disruptors, meaning newly accepted ways of credentialing that's being accepted by the employer space, right? Ernst & Young has said for certain types of disciplines or certain types of credentials that they're no longer going to require a college degree, right? So we're facing business disruptors, right? And how are colleges going to adapt to those disruptors? Some of the things you guys deal with are not even in this list, but let me ask you this. which one of you would say that your biggest concern would be fiscal solvency on this list? Now, how about enrollment pressures, including persistence and what's that?
It's all related.
Yeah, they're all
You can't have physical
that's a good point.
without enrollment.
That's a good point. So, and that's even going to come through when you look at your risks and your decision making as a portfolio of trade-offs later when Kathy talks. So we got evolving compliance now, unfunded mandates that just keep going on, and you keep getting new ones all the time. So Risk and Insurance magazine quoted 7 critical risks facing higher education generally, and some of which we just looked at. Number 1, fiscal solvency. Number 7 is cybersecurity, but that's rising. The more data, because of the technology platforms we have that we start gathering, the more we put PII at risk. I can tell you, I've worked with some institutions to where I know they have about 150 spreadsheets of PII floating around all over campus, right? And it's just because institutions haven't historically either resourced that area, maybe they didn't have enough money, they had to make trade-offs in resource allocation, or they just didn't think about the real dangers of protecting data that exists today. Look at number 5, erosion of public trust in higher education. How many of you have been a little concerned about that? I've heard a lot about it yesterday, actually, about how we need, when you were commenting to the department officials about how we might need to help with changing the narrative about instilling trust back into the college process. And Forbes magazine had 7 challenges facing higher education that cost, as number 1, is turning off potential customers. Well, we all know that is not the problem in this group here because you have institutions that are really affordable. It's about getting that student that you are working with across that bridge of opportunity, right? That's without putting them into such a debt-burdened state. And I would suspect that a lot of your students probably don't go into as much debt as some of the larger traditional schools. Would you agree with that, or would you not agree with that? Or do you think they go into more debt? No opinions? About the same, right? Okay. But would you think it's that the cost or the price tag at your institution is a turnoff to students? Do you think so? Because some, like community colleges, for example, I'm a product of a community college in Southern Illinois, and I think maybe, it was $63 a credit hour or something like that. This was quite a while ago. But it is still really, really affordable compared to the 4-year institutions. So there are some of you who have institutions whose price tag, it is pretty affordable. But in general, this is the list of the 7 things. All right, so my last comment, or that I want to draw your attention to, is if we are accustomed to dealing with issues as they arise, and we oftentimes look at how we're going to treat one issue and how that might impact something else, usually in a binary format. What I'm asking you to do is if you look at this chart here, and it's not all representative, that if you look at your risk collectively in different buckets and you look at them all together and you do this in a disciplined way and see them through a portfolio view, that way you can consider multiple trade-offs as to one trade-off with a particular decision. And Kathy's going to take you through that process of what that might look like and how you might operationalize that at your institution. Because our main goal is more about practicality today and trying to engage you as leaders to think about your role into seeing a bigger picture of risk to accomplishing your mission and how you can be more intelligent about measuring those risks and hopefully making the best decision that you possibly can, for the future of your institution. So how about crisis preparedness? Is that a big concern for a lot of you? Emergency. And a lot of times crisis preparedness is not a big concern at all until a crisis happens, right? And then everybody remembers like, oh crap, man, we haven't even ran through any practice scenarios here, right? So it's often one of those that it's not a attractive thing to talk about. It's often swept under the rug because of the thinking that, and maybe it's a fallacy, that it's a very low likelihood that we're going to have a crisis. How about physical infrastructure? So let's think about deferred maintenance. Every dollar that you put into deferred maintenance maybe, I don't know if there's a good way to measure this, might make your campus a little bit more attractive for recruiting and admissions. But is it taking away dollars that you could hire another faculty member with and manage the class size, right? Or hire another officer or another security system and make your campus safer, right? How can you look at all of these buckets of risk here and measure the trade-offs to where you are accepting as a president of what your risk posture is? So with that, I would invite you to listen to my colleague, Kathy Zelnick, who is a risk management pro, who will give you some tools that you can think about operationalizing at your institutions to look at a portfolio of risks. Thank you.
It starts at 2:20. Hi, everyone. I am just going to be kind of extending some of the things that Michael shared with you earlier. And it really is about creating an infrastructure for you to clearly understand the trade-offs. As was mentioned earlier, when we were talking about enrollment and revenue and what was more important, I think someone in the audience said, well, they're all intertwined, and in fact, they are. It's really about creating an infrastructure where you have your unique objectives and goals and the unique missions of your particular institutions, understand where you're willing to take on risk and where you're willing to not take on risk. I'm going to start just very elementary and run through the first 3 slides and just tell you right off the bat that risk is the possibility that an event will occur and affect your ability to hit your strategy and your business objectives. And enterprise risk management in the collective is about creating an entire infrastructure to manage this across all levels of the portfolio. This is my most important message to you all. A risk isn't good or bad, it just is. As you guys are helping your students in your institutions achieve their dreams, you are taking on risk. And this is good because the value that you're generating, the positive outcomes that you're creating for your students are all good things. But there's a lot of uncertainty there. So there is risk in achieving those goals. But it isn't bad. You're doing it because it's really cool. And that's what this slide is trying to say. Let's talk about risk, because without taking risk, you don't get those greatest achievements. And my favorite is, why do cars have brakes? It's to make them go. So a lot of folks see myself and those in my community as people that want to come in the room and tell you to not do things. I'm telling you, do things, do more things, take on more risk. If the thing that you're achieving creates value, if it helps you achieve your goals and your objectives, I'm like, let's take some more risk, but let's do it deliberately. Let's do it in a way that we understand exactly where that uncertainty is. And I think Diane Jones mentioned earlier when we were talking about verification, she very boldly said, we recognize risks to students when they go through the verification process and it is seemingly so cumbersome that it might be a deal breaker for them continuing on their goals. And she said, and you're probably going to see this quote, they are willing to take on risks associated with improper payments in order to reduce the burden on our students. To me, that is an excellent example of understanding the performance goals and the things that you want to achieve and the risks that you're willing to take on and the risks that you are not willing to take on. And I thought that that was extremely bold. Michael talked a lot about ERM and avoiding crisis management. ERM is a holistic approach to talking about risk at all levels so that you understand that uncertainty early on. It's a proactive look out. I always liken it to your house and fire risk. Crisis is your house is on fire, and you have one option. That's to call the fire department, because they are the ones that will come and put that out. A better approach, a risk management approach, would be to recognize when you move into your home that you've got fire risk. And there's a lot of things you can do at that point in time. You can create a structure with non-flame retardant materials. You can use wood alternatives. You have rules around no barbecuing in the living room. That you can have an evacuation plan, right? There's the variety of proactive things that you can do in a look-forward risk management space are many. But once a crisis occurs, you're in crisis mode. There's often gut reactions. There's not those deliberate kind of contemplative discussions. You're just doing something. So one of the things that we're really trying to get you guys to do is recognize what your mission and objectives are, and now have those conversations about the kinds of uncertainty that are in your programs and in the things that you're doing in your environment that would keep you from getting there. Or are there things you need to do more of that are even riskier, but again, the outcome is positive? Oops. Oh, there was did you see that cool thing? There was a little thing there. Totally missed that. I could talk to you about this, but I think that we've already introduced the idea that talking about risk is good. And that is where you can, when you recognize the uncertainty ahead of time to achieving your goals, you can put in plans. There are things that you can do to make sure that you reach those goals. It takes an organizational-wide approach so that you don't solve things in silos, so that the things that are important to me may not be the things that are overall the most important to your institution. And it is about making good decisions using the risk lens. Performance and risk, they're next door neighbors. They complement one another. You can't talk about performance without talking about risk. You guys may have different kinds of goals that you want to achieve. And the way that you achieve them, each of those has different risk profiles. There could be a way that you achieve those goals that introduce a lot of uncertainty, and maybe you can take it slower and there's less uncertainty, but it's using that risk lens to recognize performance and risk as sitting together. As I mentioned before, it's about creating a proactive approach, and then this is kind of on the execution side. You want a standard set of tools so that when I talk about risk, we all kind of know what we're talking about together. This graphic here, so I was on the team that got to rewrite the COSO framework for enterprise risk management. There's also ISO 31000. I have a bias, but both of them is good, and all of them moving from their old versions to start tying together strategy, performance, and risk. In the old-timey way we practiced risk, the risk practitioner sat over there, and we had our checklists, and maybe we came and talked to you, but it was a one-off exercise, and if the risk people didn't find it, maybe there wasn't any risk there. This new approach is about recognizing that risk folks don't own risk. You guys in the execution of the missions of your institution, you're the ultimate risk owners. You own the processes, the programs, the projects. You have accountability for the objectives and the goals. Bottom line, you guys own the risk. And what a risk practitioner can do to really help you all is give you the tools to have those risk conversations, understanding how things are related, and if you take more uncertainty here, you create transparency in the value or the outcome that you intend on trying to get. And also this graphic would tell you, push those risk conversations further up. When you're up at the mission and strategy setting level, recognize that you want to set strategies that in fact align with your mission. I have a short anecdote about bush beans. The president and CEO of Bush Beans one day looked out of his office window and saw a fleet of trucks. And he said, I'm not in the trucking business. How much of my resource time and energy is being spent trying to figure out how to get my beans places and not figuring out what kinds of beans we all want? And he divested himself of the trucking business. To me, that's an excellent example of creating a strategy, a whole line of business that didn't align with the mission. And I think you all have that challenges as I sat through some of your sessions yesterday and today to see that you guys have missions that are very unique to the students that you serve, and that there might be some pressure for you guys to have a line of business or a strategy that might not fit with your particular, honest to goodness, mission of your institution. So that'd be the first thing. And then the second thing is recognizing when you're pursuing your mission that there are different ways to do it. It's, again, bring that risk conversation up and recognize that each way of accomplishing your mission has to it its own unique risk profile, and just understand that. And then the last one, risk to strategy and performance, that's one that we're very familiar with. You guys have made a decision, now you go, I wonder how risky that is. And there's still value to doing that, because that's where the execution of a lot of our programs are. But I would really encourage you all to push that conversation up. This is a very cool graphic, wink, wink, about some of the foundational pieces and components of an overall framework. And it starts with culture, and I think that's where you all come in you're key, because you guys in the next two slides will say this, you are the ones that set the tone at the top, and you want to make sure, there's a couple things I do want to say about that. That you embrace the idea of being risk aware, that you allow these risk conversations to get in the room. There are a lot of folks that really are uncomfortable. And frankly, the folks in the room, when you start having these risk conversations, all of them will be uncomfortable, because that old kind of paradigm will come into play, and it makes an awkward conversation. Hold folks accountable for risk, and that's okay. Again, aligning it with strategy and objective setting. The analyzed business context means make sure that we all understand that we're not operating in an environment that's stayed. It's dynamic. Things are moving. Policy is changing. States are changing. Our student demographic is changing. Everything is changing. So it's making sure that you build a proactive lens in your conversations. In performance, they're next door. When you're considering performance, try to target the kinds of things that you could measure ahead of measuring performance that would let you know that, in fact, that performance is in jeopardy. Performance measures are often lagging, meaning they've already happened. You'll measure at a point in time for a period of performance that's gone by. And if you made it, great. If you didn't, oops. Key risk indicators are leading indicators. They're things that you can measure to help you know that you might be in danger of making your target. And that's what I would encourage. Review and revision is just about ERM and making sure that your program is giving you the results that actually can influence your decision making. And information communicating and reporting makes sure that you have the information available for decision makers at all levels of your organization. And it starts with you guys. It's the tone at the top. That really is the most important piece here. But risk management is everywhere and for everyone. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wally Coy and talk to you about cyber risk. Thank you.
All right.
Just want to make one comment for the group. I see a lot of people taking pictures of the slides. The slides will be available for you. They'll be downloadable for everyone, as well as you'll get a survey after this as well. So just wanted to make sure, so you don't fill up all your pictures with slides. You'll be able to get those slides after the presentation. Sorry about that, Wally.
Okay, no worries. First of all, to sort of segue to cyber risk, cybersecurity risk, federal student aid maintains several risk registers, including an enterprise risk portfolio. And I believe cyber risk is either ENT 001 or 002. I don't remember which one. It's up there. So it is a big concern, because federal student aid is essentially a financial and technology organization, because the $1.5 trillion in loans portfolio we have is really, it's all electronic. And we have over 140 million records on students and personally identifiable information. And a lot of those records are held at your institution, several million, I believe, for schools in this category. So it is really a big concern. One thing I want to talk about first is definitions. I've run into professionals and security professionals, technology professionals, risk professionals, who
misuse terminology, and threat, vulnerability, and risk, they interchangeably use these terms, but they have very distinct meanings, especially when you're talking about risk management, enterprise risk management. From a security standpoint, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is the guidance the federal government uses, and it's also guidance that a lot of Fortune 500 corporations are using, and financial organizations, and it's free. Schools can use it. So a threat is a circumstance or event that can adversely impact your organization. It can be a result of a human error, an intentional human action. It can be environmental. It can be natural. The forest fires in Northern California are an example. Impact facilities and access to systems. It can damage systems. So the threat universe is always out there. Natural, environmental, human. The threats are always there. You can't do anything about them. Vulnerabilities are something that you can address through an effective security program. Through vulnerabilities can be mitigated through controls and procedures, technical controls, patching your endpoints and PCs, and maintaining the latest security configurations, for example. And risk is basically, it's the product of the probability or function of the probability and the impact of realizing an event. So if your probability is 1 and the impact is you lose all of your data due to a ransomware attack, then the risk is realized, then it becomes an issue or an event, and that's something you want to avoid. On the next slide here. The consequences of a cyber breach can vary. It can be the compromise of PII, which is what the government is very concerned about, because it can be a conduit and a precursor to fraud events. Your data can be corrupted. You may not know it's corrupted. Financial transactions can be corrupted. Academic records can be altered, for example. You could have a denial of service to your systems, and that can be through a ransomware attack. And we're based in Washington, D.C., obviously, and Baltimore City comes to mind, where they had a ransomware attack, and they've never recovered the data. I think they spent something like shy of $20 million to rebuild their systems. Oh, and they got a cyber insurance policy for $20 million in case it happens next time. But that's probably not the most effective way of coping with those kinds of risks. I mentioned earlier identity theft and fraud scenarios. Compromise of cybersecurity is a conduit and an initial step in going to the next step, which is stealing money, stealing funds, stealing identities of your students. That's the bad news. The good news is that 90% of your cybersecurity risks can be mitigated with what's called cyber hygiene and basic controls and user education. It sounds easy. We see large corporations and large organizations and schools that experience compromises, but 90% of your problems you can tackle by having a good security program that I'll talk about a little later here. And Kathy, you had this slide on, I didn't know it was going to do all that fancy stuff, but who's responsible? The answer is everyone's responsible, but what I'm going to focus on is what you all as executives, top executives and presidents need to know, and questions you need to ask of your technical people, your administrative people, third parties providing services, and even of your students that are end users. So the top 5 threats or threat vectors to your data and your cybersecurity. The first one is human behavior, people doing stuff, making mistakes, going to a nefarious website, having that website download some malware, maybe a keylogger that'll record passwords, and they don't know it, and they've compromised your machine. If that happens to be a database administrator, they may have compromised the entire student record database, for example. Network connectivity, being connected to the internet is a vulnerability, major vulnerability. Endpoint devices, if your systems are compromised, they will be compromised through a PC, a smartphone, or a tablet. That's almost a universal truth statement I can make. And weaknesses in authentication, someone guessing your passwords, not having good password policies, not having two-factor authentication for critical systems, and everyone has a smartphone these days. I can almost assume that. App stores can be threat vectors of malware. Applications that maybe are not legitimate have made it to Google's App Store. Even Apple with iTunes has had some apps that were not good actors make it into their store that can get on your phone and cause major problems. All right. Let's see here. Oops. I think they had three. Is that three the same slide? All right, let me go on the next one here. So phishing, I'm sure everybody's heard of phishing, but there are variants of phishing that have evolved where you basically try to trick someone, an end user, into revealing information about the enterprise, their identity, their password. One way is to send SMS text messages, and you could send a message that can appear to be coming from someone, and it can be spoofed, and you reply to it, and you may have compromised an account. I mentioned this earlier, keyloggers. Keyloggers can be downloaded nefariously just by going to a website that has that code, or opening an email. And a virus checker may not detect a keylogger because a lot of these attacks are fileless attacks. They don't deposit any actual code on your machine. Farming is basically redirecting your attempt to go to an internet website to a nefarious site. If you misspell a website, there may be a website out there that will link on that misspelling, and it's not really your website that you wanted to go to. Watering hole attacks, there are typical websites that the educational sector typically frequents, and those sites are subject to compromise, and you also have malware deposited on your endpoint through those sites, as an example. So the next step of a successful phishing attack or compromise of an endpoint is account takeover, starting with an individual user's email account, compromising the attack by learning the password or intercepting your communications across, say, like the free hotel Wi-Fi, which is not secure. I don't recommend using it for sending emails. I'll surf the internet on it, but I won't send emails on it, for example. So there's a process that account takeover attacks follow. There may be a period of reconnaissance where they just watch your emails and your traffic. You may be talking to vendors, you may be communicating with students, and they kind of see who you're talking to, who your trading partners there are. The ultimate goal is to exfiltrate sensitive information or steal funds. If they have access to your email, you may have a spreadsheet in that email somewhere that contains student records, for example, or financial aid records. They'll try to find that. They'll look for other emails, for other people you communicate with, and try to compromise them and try to phish them, spoofing an email to appear as if it's coming from the university president, for example. There are variations on account takeover. I won't get into them, but one is business email compromise, where they compromise the email system of your entire organization, or vendor email compromise, and combine those two, and funds can be exfiltrated and stolen. I'm going to move a little quicker here. I mentioned earlier Wi-Fi. The hotel Wi-Fi doesn't require a password, isn't secure. You don't really know if you're connecting that hotel's Wi-Fi spot. You don't know who you're really connecting with. That is a potential entry path for threats. Your students, they may be at Starbucks or at a restaurant or at McDonald's. Or if you're a university president and you use the Wi-Fi at McDonald's, maybe it's not really the McDonald's Wi-Fi. You don't know. User behavior on mobile platforms are notoriously insecure. This is a Verizon study was done this year. I've seen studies that these numbers were vastly higher, but basically saying half of smartphone users do not use passwords. Smartphone users go to hundreds of unique IPs a day, and the more IPs you go to, the more websites, the greater your chance of getting compromised. A third of users don't use encryption for communication or email. I believe they tested 30 applications. These were banking applications, because, for example, and each application had at least one vulnerability that could be exploited. If phishing doesn't work, guessing your password doesn't work, they'll brute force your password. There are password files available for purchase and applications that can scan through literally billions of password combinations, and your password can very easily be guessed. I hope nobody's password is on the 25 most commonly used passwords of 2018. Also, I'll mention here, and there's a link to a NIST publication that gives you much more detail than you probably even want to see. NIST is now recommending that you use passphrases versus password. The whole concept of special character and one number and uppercase and lowercase, that's not really leading to more security. It's leading people to just write their passwords down. So,
That was way too much laughter.
yes. So if you check that list, if your password's on there, I change it. So what questions do you ask as an executive of your technical staff, your business staff? Do we have documented security policies and controls? What are those controls based on? Are we using two-factor authentication for our critical systems? Do we do testing and penetration scanning? I know the department and most of government, they do regular penetration tests and vulnerability scans of their systems. That's highly recommended. Incident response plans. If something happens, something will happen. Do you have a tested incident response plan? And under contingency plans, business continuity plans, the most important thing is, do we have tested backups to protect us against ransomware attacks? That would really help Baltimore City, I know, but they didn't. And awareness education, users need to know all this. The more you educate them, the more you test them, and the better your posture will be. Detecting, responding, recovering from a breach. More important than anything else is how you respond to an incident. The most important thing here is, have you done an exercise, even a tabletop, where you rehearse what you're going to do if you have a breach, if you have a ransomware attack? If you don't practice it, you're going to be really bad at it once it happens. And testing backups is the most important. If all you do is have multiple generations of backups and you test them and you isolate them from your networks, that will give you a major level of protection. And I think, Kathy, you mentioned Bush's beans, and I don't think that's a golden retriever, but in my past lives in this business, almost universally, failures in security and major compromises, including a financial institution where somebody tried to steal $1 billion in funds by wiring them to casinos in the Philippines. That was a foreign country, no bank in the United States. There was a failure in governance. The technical people, the people in the operational environments, they want to do the right thing, but the risks are not communicated up to the top. You all, as executives, presidents, your job is to communicate the risks and ask the questions. of technical staff and administrative staff. Do we have these, where's our security policy? Could I see that? How often do you do a penetration test? Ask all these questions. You should have answers. Also, your staff. You may have someone that has security duties, but are they qualified for that? That's very, 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 very important. So communicating in board speak and business language is most important. The board can make the decision based on risk appetite, based on recommendations from the president, from executives, and that needs to be documented. I'll go a little faster through these. One of the challenges you all face, and this was a survey here of really huge institutions and firms with $1 billion in gross revenue. You notice the education sector tends to spend the least, and these are the biggest of the biggest. So the challenge is efficiently and effectively using your resources. You have limited human and financial resources. Have a good strategy, collaborate with your peers. The board needs to approve the strategy and the resources, and you have to make the business case. And there should be a feedback loop. For example, if you have requirements for, technical requirements for configurations and policies, who's checking them? Are you complying with your own policy? Are you patching your devices? Elements of a program, I recommend look at NIST because all their stuff is free. If you go to ISO, they charge for every single document as standard. So NIST is a good place to start. There are tons of documents. There are basic awareness documents to read at the executive level to understand what it is that you need to know as far as cybersecurity goes. So, closing points. Ask the questions as an executive. Policy, do we have procedures? Do we test our security? Do we have backups? Who tests our backups? What kind of education program do we have? And this even extends to what are we telling our students and even parents? It's like, what is the minimum security configuration you should have on your laptop, for example? Cyber hygiene, 90% of your threats, 90% of your vulnerabilities against threats can be mitigated by good cyber hygiene. You should have a risk management program, and you should cover cybersecurity risks as part of that program. And any security compromise is a precursor and a potential facilitator of cyber crime and financial crime and stealing identities and money and all that stuff. And Stephanie's going to go next, and I hope I didn't run too long or over. That's good. You're good. All right.
Thank you, Wally. As Wally said, much of the cyber risk is a precursor to stealing money. So let's talk about a couple of examples of what are some dollar amounts that we're talking about. $25 million resulting from 126 distance education schemes that use stolen identities, prisoners, straw students, and other techniques to illegally obtain financial aid. The purchasing director at a university stole more than $650,000 using a purchasing card by altering or creating fake credit card statements. The president of a school embezzled money from roughly 260 students. No, of course not. Totaling over $900,000. We had an instance of a doctoral candidate was one of 7 defendants that gave kickbacks to a financial aid director for unjustified financial aid payments, a conspiracy that equaled $1.4 million. So all of these sort of outrageous stories are the result of fraud. So let's define fraud. And because we're the feds, of course, we want to give you an acronym to remember what fraud is. But essentially, fraud is financial reward that is acquired using deception. You're getting something of value through lying. So what leads people to commit fraud? And there really are 3 three influencing factors here. The first opportunity is one that is within your control. Opportunity is basically the fraudster found there was a lack of prevention in place. There were a lack of oversight, lax internal rules, internal controls. So they found the opportunity to take advantage of. The next two factors are really lie with the fraudster themselves. The first being motivation or pressure. This looks like I have high levels of debt or other financial pressures. There may be gambling or drug problems, or perhaps they just want to live well above their means. And then the third factor is rationalization or attitude. So this sounds like, I deserve this. They don't pay me enough. It's a small amount. No one's ever going to miss it. I'm only borrowing it for a short time. I'll repay it. So where, or more importantly, who are your fraud risk? And essentially, the long story short of this is anyone that's even tangentially related to something of value can be a fraud risk. It can lie with your students, your applicants, your colleagues, officers at your schools. If you think back to those examples that we talked about at the beginning, a wide variety of people were participating in those fraud schemes. So do you have a responsibility to worry about fraud? I mean, we all think, yes, of course, it's a good idea. But do you have a responsibility to report it? And the short answer is yes, you do. There is regulatory guidance that requires you report to the Inspector General any credible information on an applicant. That could be a current student or an applicant to your school, or an administrator, basically anyone working at the school or your campus, that you suspect of committing fraud. So how do we go about, we have this responsibility, how do we go about managing fraud? And really the solution lies with you and your teams. I'm going to just pull all of these up. You want to think strategically about the best person or persons in your organizations, at your campuses, that can tackle this issue. Who can pull people together across various silos? What resources do you already have? How are you going to measure success? And how are you going to tackle the challenges that are inevitably going to come with taking a proactive stance against fraud? We've talked a lot earlier about the tone at the top. This is critical for fraud. It's an important issue that needs attention, but you have a lot of important issues that need attention. So it's up to you to make sure everyone knows it's important to take this seriously, and you want to support your front lines. So when allegations of fraud surface, you have to be committed to investigating them, as well as ensuring there are consequences when fraud is discovered. It's also important that you keep in mind your particular organization, your particular campus. Not every approach is going to make sense for every school. You have different resources, whether those are human, financial, or technology. You're different sizes. You provide your services in different ways. All of these are things you have to keep in mind when you're establishing an approach to fraud risk. And most importantly, again, we talked a little bit about supporting your front lines. Prevention and detection are the two main pieces to frontline fraud prevention. Prevention, of course, is the security guard. These are the processes and procedures in place that deter or block fraud from occurring. It's your internal controls, shredding documents, separation of duties, shredding sensitive information, training your staff. You can't prevent all fraud, so it's also important that you are able to detect it. Can your staff detect the anomalies or common characteristics that indicate fraud? Do they review documents thoroughly, ask questions, verify authenticity? Do they request additional information if something seems suspicious? Are they able to compare information from different documents or sources? So here are some of the ways you can ensure that your community is aware of fraud, and understand that they have not only a responsibility to combat it, but to prevent it, and make sure that they have the appropriate tools in place to do so. Finally, we talked a little bit earlier about your obligation to report to the Inspector General any suspicion of fraud. I just wanted to show a little bit of the difference between federal student aid's role in investigating fraud versus the Inspector General. And the investigatory authority actually lies with the Inspector General. They have the authority, the law enforcement authority, to conduct criminal and civil investigations. Federal student aid is a much more administrative process. We have compliance reviews, can take administrative actions, but we also have a responsibility to report to the IG any suspicions of fraud. So again, we've got that responsibility. I just wanted to show a little bit of how that differs between the Inspector General's role as well as FSA. So in wrapping up, I want us just to think back to those few examples of fraud that we discussed initially. The $25 million in distance education fraud rings, the $650,000 in fake purchase card transactions, the $1.4 million from a conspiracy with a financial aid director, and $900,000 in embezzled funds. The Inspector General was able to investigate and ultimately successfully prosecute the fraudsters in those schemes because of people just like you and the teams you have in place on your campuses. People who were paying attention, asked questions, and reported suspicious activities. So as leaders on your campus, I encourage you to set a tone of intolerance for fraud, dedicate resources to supporting fraud risk management, and appoint a champion for your fraud risk management efforts. And with that, I'm not sure if we have time for a little bit of Q&A, so I'll turn it over to Ray in case we do, but thank you.
Can we get a hand for all our panelists? Very quickly, does anybody have any questions? We have a time for about 2 questions. Does anybody have any questions regarding risk management, fraud, or cybersecurity risk that they'd like to pose? No questions? Again, the slides will be available, as well as the staff members from FSA will be available to talk to you after. Some of you may have particular issues that are representative of your school or your institution that you may want to talk offline about, as well as you can contact any of us. If you look in the pamphlet that we have there, it's first name, last name at ed.gov if you want to have some other detailed information or feedback from the staff members here. Could give them another hand, please? Thank you. One last thing, too, you will be receiving a survey after today for every session that you can give comments and feedback so that we can increasingly make our presentations better as well as the entire conference. So without further ado, Dr. Joel Hurl will come back to the stage. Thank you, guys.